So a few months ago I posted this video just here about colossal squid, and people started asking me the same questions. Surely it's obvious that the reason we can't find the colossal squid is because we keep blinding it with bright white lights. And surely scientists knew this, and if they did, why do they keep doing it?
There is real evidence, of course, that our lights can damage deep sea eyes, and that many animals, including possibly the colossal squid, flee from them.
But it's kind of complicated, because once you get past the obvious, it turns out that pretty much everything else about this topic is far less settled.
So let's start here. These are hydrothermal vents, and they were only discovered in 1977. And to be honest, they're some of the strangest places on Earth. No sunlight reaches them, so life like these vent shrimp survive instead on chemicals pouring out of the crust, which is pretty strange. Now, scientists have been exploring these vents since the late 1970s, using submersibles and ROVs fitted with bright white lights. But years later, the scientists that were studying these shrimp noticed something a little bit odd. They looked perfectly healthy, until they looked at their eyes under a microscope. Their eyes aren't really like ours though, they're sort of enlarged, fused photoreceptive organs. It's a bit like if I snipped off your eyelid, pulled your eyeball out, and then shone a torch directly into your naked retinas, which is a pretty horrific thought, of course. Now, in some shrimp, the retinas look like this, pink and healthy. But in others, they turned this sort of chalky white colour. It seemed that the retinas had been damaged or destroyed. But it's important to be a little bit careful here though, right? Because although those shrimp had been in contact with bright white lights, they'd also been in water that's hot enough to melt lead.
Okay, so I'm sat here editing this video, and whilst I'm doing so, I'm doing a little bit more reading. And I'm realising that this topic is kind of massive and there's things I've missed. So throughout this video, I'll make some additional points. Here's number one. There's a really interesting point in this paper about some analysis that was done on deep sea isopods, and they found that with individuals that are exposed to ordinary room light, they exhibited little damage after initial exposure of either 10 or 60 minutes, and nearly complete recovery after 12 hours in darkness. And obviously guys, healthy discussion is more than welcome, so feel free to leave any additions, questions, or thoughts on things I might have got wrong down in the comments.
Now, I also spoke to the queen of deep sea exploration about this, Edie Widder, and she told me a story that shows just how sensitive these deep sea eyes really are.
After bringing some specimens up from the deep and covering them with a tarp.
It was under a full moon, and the tarp blew off the trawl bucket, and all of those eyes, when we looked at them later under the microscope, were blown away just from the moonlight.
But this doesn't just happen to shrimps that are collected for science. I've actually got an example right now in my oven. Hang on. If you trawl up a langoustine onto a sunlit deck, the same thing happens. This is scampi. Quite good. So if we know that light can cause damage, why don't we just stop sending lights down there?
Oh, we have to have much better understanding of life on our own planet. I mean, it's insane that we don't even know what's down there. How can we protect it if we don't know what's there? And how can we get people enthused about protecting it if they don't know what's there?
Without these expeditions, we wouldn't even know that these hydrothermal vents existed, or countless other things in the deep sea. You can't protect things that you don't understand, right? Or even know are there. So if bright white lights are as bad as we think they are, then why don't all deep sea creatures just avoid them? I've spent the last few years dropping cameras. Hang on. So this is one of my custom-built deep water camera housings. We've been dropping these into the Indo-Pacific, primarily looking for sharks and rays. And I must admit, the way that a lot of these species interact with bright light is a little bit counterintuitive.
So these are spur dogs, armed with venomous spines in front of their dorsal fins, and they're swimming pretty much straight towards almost 10,000 lumens of bright white light. They pretty much show no interest in avoiding it, they're just fixed on the bait in their cage. I've seen the same from other sharks and rays too, including the western spotted gummy shark and the purple eagle ray.
And it isn't just the sharks and rays either. Edie told me quite an interesting story about squids reacting kind of bizarrely to light as well.
We were filming Humboldt squid, and we were coming up from a dive, just passed through the oxygen minimum zone, and we're around 600 feet, and there were over 100 Humboldt squid feeding on lanternfish, but they weren't bothered by our white lights at all in this particular case. They seemed to be using them to be able to locate their prey.
Different animals experience the world differently. A shark, like these spur dogs, hunting by smell, isn't leaning on its vision the same way a midwater predator does, one that's constantly watching for tiny flashes of bioluminescence. But the Humboldt squid adds another piece. It migrates hundreds of meters towards the surface every night, so it meets far bigger swings in light than any permanent deep-sea species. And shallow water is incredibly bright. Anything that lives in the shallows takes that light hit pretty much daily. So there isn't really a single deep sea response to light.
And this is what makes it difficult, right? If we're watching a couple of species react completely differently to exactly the same light, then simply observing behaviour probably doesn't tell us much about whether they're being harmed or not. So how are we supposed to know? So we know light damages deep sea eyes, so why do so many creatures just stay where they are?
This deep sea fish is a viperfish. Now, at first glance, this behaviour looks pretty reassuring, right? I mean, the submersible approaches with its lights already on the animal, and the fish doesn't seem to react.
So for years, that's how footage like this viperfish footage was interpreted. If the animal isn't swimming away, then it mustn't be distressed. But Edie offered a bit of a different explanation.
When you come up on it with a submersible, it just poses there, freezes in the water. And you can get very close to it until it feels the pressure wave, and then it takes off. And the presumption is actually that the bright lights have actually blinded it, so it's not seeing any of your light.
The catch is that although these black-skinned fanged fish look like pure predators, almost everything down here is both predator and prey.
And whilst I was editing this video, I was reminded of probably the perfect example of this concept. This is probably some of the craziest footage I've ever seen. This is footage of a dragonfish, the ferocious fanged predator, reaching the end of its life at the hands of a shrimp. Can't really be a more embarrassing way to go in the deep ocean than that, right? I think the crew filming it found it kind of funny as well. Hang on a second.
Oh my god. Wow.
That's ridiculous.
The bioluminescence down there is basically a minefield. So if you trim out in the submersible and then go dead still in the water, you see no luminescence. You have to disturb it to be able to see it. And yet when you move, it's everywhere, all around you. And so all of these animals have to be negotiating this minefield all the time that could expose them at any moment to the eyes of a predator. And so for a viperfish to freeze like that is actually adaptive behavior that actually makes sense when you understand the lightscape.
So most of the deep sea is just hardwired to stay still, because usually moving is way more dangerous. There might be more to it than that though, right? Because an animal that's designed to pick out like the tiniest little flashes of bioluminescence might simply not register a big wall of light like this. By the way guys, I'm actually filming this in total darkness with two very bright white lights shining right in my eyes just to really understand what it must be like to be a deep sea fish. I guess this is like method acting, right, for YouTube. Regardless, these animals would never naturally meet bright white light, so they've got neither the anatomy to protect themselves from it, nor the neural pathways to tell them to avoid it.
So none of this has been nailed down experimentally, because like a lot of stuff in the deep ocean, it's hard and it's expensive.
I mean, a lot of this stuff would just be so obvious if we were just doing the kind of behavioral observations that were so taken for granted on land. But there's clearly hierarchies of behavior, you know, depending on what the drivers are. So depending on how hungry they are, for example, or whether, you know, they're in a mating phase or not.
Hunger, or another sense entirely, could outweigh visual caution. So maybe the spur dog's eyes are actually being damaged, they're just way too hungry to care.
Okay, interjection number 2. The first paper here talks about behavioral plasticity in sharks. What this basically means is that many sharks, including those from the Squalus genus, are able to make use of a concoction of different senses. It also talks about how odour is generally the first signal detected. When they get closer to prey items, the preferred sensory modalities varied among species, but with vision being one of them. Unlike the crustaceans, members of the Squalus genus have some capacity to change their pupil area. And there was an increase of 12.4% in the pupil area of this species from their light adapted state. So they can somewhat control the amount of light entering their eye. It's worth noting, by the way, that the species that I filmed in Indonesia were all filmed at about 150 to 200 meters. So there's still a little bit of light there, and they're not really living in the same conditions as a true deep sea shark. Species of deep sea fish have been successfully maintained in the laboratory, and while artificial light may temporarily overload the visual system, virtually all fish seem to recover their visual capabilities after a few hours or days if they are kept in the dark. So this raises an interesting point, of course, about the difference between eyes that have been permanently damaged versus eyes that have just been dazzled. With the spur dogs, their eyes have probably just been dazzled, so there's a good chance they'll recover back to 100%. But
if behaviour can't reliably tell us what's happening, how do we know if we've caused damage or not?
Okay, so the answer is inside the eye itself. We obviously have a pupil that adjusts to light, we can blink and squint, and our retinas also adjust all the time.
Many deep-sea eyes have none of that though, because they evolved for completely the opposite problem. Their job isn't to cope with changing light, but to gather as much of it as physically possible.
I mean, the colossal squid's eye is about as big as my head. Right. This isn't a very accurate way of doing it, but let's see. 61 centimeters. What percentile is it? The answer is 90th to 95th percentile. I'll take that. Okay, so the eye of a colossal squid is about 27 centimeters in diameter. 27 equals 84 centimeters. A bit bigger than my noggin then.
Others pack their retinas with light-sensitive pigments, and some have almost abandoned conventional vision entirely, like our vent shrimp. It's actually thought that their photoreceptive organs are used to detect the faint glow of the vents, so they can settle on them, and also make sure that they don't accidentally wander into their boiling fumes. That sensitivity comes at a cost, of course, but the amount of damage depends on a few things, right? Like the intensity of the light, its energy, how long it's exposed for, and also whether the animal has ever been in contact with white light before. And you usually can't see any of it. The animal doesn't float to the surface. It often just swims off looking completely normal.
Okay, really interesting addition. So this paper here covered the long-term survival and growth of Norway lobsters, which is our langoustine or scampi. And they were comparing recapture and growth rates in lobsters with and without eye damage. And what they found was that the final portions of the recaptured specimens were found to be independent of eye damage condition. And more importantly, there was also no evidence that growth rate was affected by eye damage. It's possible that the result is the same with the vent shrimp. So their eyes are permanently damaged, but it doesn't really affect them long term.
So maybe the photoreceptive organs in the vent shrimp are just a nice to have, rather than a necessity.
If scientists knew all along that white light was causing so much damage, then why didn't they just stop using it? So the question you're probably asking now is, why don't we just use lights like this? This is infrared. Is it on? Yep, that is on, believe it or not. Infrared is lower energy, and as far as we're aware, it doesn't really cause any deep sea animals damage. The problem is that water is just an optical nightmare.
The problem was that the cameras weren't sensitive enough. Even if you used a red light camera, it was still a fairly insensitive infrared or red light camera. And there were quite a few people that had tried to use red light because they recognized that it was a problem, but they saw nothing because the cameras were so insensitive.
You can be less intrusive and use infrared light, or you can actually see what's down there and use white light. You can't really do both.
I had a super intensified camera. It was actually a tube camera called an ISIT for intensified silicon intensified target, and I was using it for being able to record the first video of bioluminescence ever recorded in the deep sea. Its sensitivity made it also much better for the red light kind of observations, and so that's what led into the work I was doing with red light illumination with the eye in the sea.
So it's easy with modern cameras to assume that earlier researchers just weren't thinking about animal welfare, right? But most of them saw the problem clearly, they just didn't have the tools to solve it.
But even then, far red lights and modern cameras aren't really like a magic cure, right? I've not actually done that much work with far red, but I have used infrared. And the reason that infrared is, to me, more interesting than far red is because it's actually invisible to humans and probably most of the deep ocean. Okay, so just to show you how quickly infrared falls off underwater, I'm sorry, this is probably a super creepy look right now, but anyway, so we've got 940 nanometer infrared, I believe. On land, as you can see, super bright, no problems whatsoever. Now let's drop it in.
With infrared, you just can't light a large volume of water the same way you can with white light, and whatever drifts past in the shadows stays a mystery.
Science. But it gets more complicated, because of course there are some fish in the deep sea that can see red.
These dragonfish can produce and detect far red light, but almost nothing else can see down there, so they've effectively got their own private channel.
So does red light hurt them? Caveat to this paper is that it only discusses pelagic organisms in Arctic and temperate regions, but it concludes that they still strongly avoid artificial light, including visible red light in the 575 to 700 nanometer range. So red light is probably less intrusive, but it doesn't mean that it doesn't cause any disturbance whatsoever. So if we know our lights can cause damage, the next question, of course, is it possible to observe the deep sea without using any light at all?
Today, there's tons of options. Researchers can use environmental DNA to identify species directly from the water. Scanning systems like Deep PIV also exist that can document fragile animals like siphonophores without ever collecting them. And low light cameras get dramatically more sensitive every year.
And interestingly, if I can find it, we actually shot that footage on a modified GoPro 7. Now, most cameras have something called an infrared cut filter in them, which basically blocks all infrared, mainly from the bright sun. With this camera, we took out the stock lens, changed it for a different one, and that enabled us to get this really cool infrared footage.
It was actually infrared that enabled me to record this really cool deep sea shark, a painted swell shark. And I think I'm right in saying this is only the second time this species has ever been caught on camera.
If we know that bright white lights can cause harm, and we now have the tools to explore the deep without using them, why do big bright white lights still dominate pretty much all deep sea exploration?
So the simple answer is that white light is just very good at showing us what's down there, and it's pretty hard to replace. It gives you colour, distance, and a much wider field of view, right? And if you're trying to identify a new species from the footage or understand behaviour, image quality is obviously incredibly important.
And it's worth being clear about why this is really necessary. Oh, this is a weird species.
2,500 meters down in the Indian Ocean, there's a snail that armors itself with iron, the scaly foot snail. It was originally known from just 3 vent fields, although it's now been found on around 8.
And in 2019, it became the first animal ever to be declared endangered, solely from deep-sea mining. And that listing only exists, of course, because scientists took ROVs down to the hydrothermal vents and documented the snails with white light. And the chances are there are tons more examples like the scaly-foot snail we just haven't found yet.
So the technology keeps improving, but the compromises don't fully go away. The vent shrimp have taught us that observation isn't always harmless, and perhaps our inability to find the colossal squid further evidences the impacts of bright light. Although, whilst I was speaking to Edie, I got thinking about something that might be a much bigger deterrent than light, something that travels way further underwater. Sound. I guess we'll have to cover that next.
By the way, guys, I'm currently getting this big old camera rig here ready to send down to, I think, 311 meters, which is the deepest point in Beaufort's Dyke, which I think is the deepest water in the UK. If you want to see the footage as soon as it's shot and also help support these deep sea adventures, guys, head over to my Patreon. There's a QR code up on the screen now. Let me know what you think about lights in the deep ocean and all the stuff we discussed in this video. And yeah, thanks for watching.